and then I will hand this man over to Satan. And you're like, this is some pretty crazy stuff.
Who was Paul? And what are some things we don't know about him?
Paul is a little bit of a maverick, and he's a threat to these other apostles.
So definitely some more kind of tension there.
Was his life a success or a failure? And I hope the point of the show is to get people to like wrestle with what does that mean for all of us. Excited to be here. I may have a coffee delivered to me in about a minute.
That's fine.
And you can edit it in or out. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, man. It's like when we launched this, there'd be so many things we'd take out, and it can take out that human like connection and like realness and authenticity. Yeah. So you started August Media, right? When did you start it?
I started about a year ago, sort of like formally as a, LLC in the state of Texas, but really we've been making content that is August Media content for about 3.5 years. So,
okay.
The company really kind of grew out of this content that we were making and realizing like, rather than making this for someone else, we had this bigger vision for what we want to do and want to own our catalog. And we want to kind of create a different brand and different kind of content. So that's where we started. And we're about a year into this process.
Well, welcome to the show. We got Dr. Matthew Larsen on the show, and he is a founder, CEO of August Media, a historian, a filmmaker. Matthew studied and taught at Yale, taught at Princeton, and is currently a full professor at the University of Copenhagen. You are honing the ability to turn complex history into stories that resonate with modern audiences. And so where I came across your stuff was I saw some ads for the series The Desert. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this looks pretty rad. Like I love the filming, the branding, all of that. And then I got the subscription to whatever platform that was on. Mm-hmm. And I watched the whole thing in one night. My wife was sitting there like, who is this? This is awesome. Fantastically done. Like very, very well done. And then you've got another series called Nobody Like Paul.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I want to do like a deep dive today and talk about Paul. You've got a lot to offer. You were like the kind of modern day Indiana Jones. We were on the phone. You're talking about how you're breaking and ripping into caves. And so I'd love to talk through some of that stuff as well from your recent travels, and then just how we can learn from you. But man, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the intro. I do want to give one update as of not that long ago. The paperwork is signed. I'll be joining the University of Texas for the next academic year as I forgot some fancy title, but the chaired professor of history of Christianity and religious studies and classics. So that's a great thing because Texas is home for us. So we're really excited about that. And then I have a question.
That's cool, man.
For you.
Yeah, let's go for it. Yeah.
Based on what you just told me about how you found the desert, one of the things that I talked about with the team who made that and the people who distributed it is like, what would you call that? Because I think a lot of the stuff that they are making are like courses or documentaries. And this was a little, I would just be very curious to hear how you would categorize that from like a video genre point of view.
Video genre? Yeah. I mean,
does that make sense? Because it's not,
what do you mean?
It's not really it's not really a documentary. It's not quite a course. I'm not sure. It's like a desert journal reflections that happen to be caught on film or something.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I would categorize it as a mini-series. And it's like, it does run like a documentary for sure, but it also runs like a history class too. Like I learned so much from you, and not in a dry way at all, like in a very exciting with the B-roll, with what you were doing. You're camping out there in Terra Lingua, and it was pretty dope, man. So I would probably say it was like a series that you can take a lot away from. It's going to build you up spiritually. You can learn more about the Bible, and then I'd probably put it as a mini series. I don't know. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm asking is it grew out of a sort of insecurity as we're making it. And as I'm seeing the first cuts of like, I don't even know what I would call this. Like if someone would be like, what is it? I'd be like, I think it's like a long form reflection with like
Yeah.
shot on Sony FX6, you know, or something. I don't know. Like it's just
Yeah.
But anyway, so
I would say so. Yeah. Well, whatever it is, it's good, and do more of it, because I was hooked, man. And
appreciate it, man. I really
it
appreciate
actually
it.
inspired me to be like, this is, yeah, like just the whole branding and everything. It was great. So, well, all right, folks, before we jump in, would love if you give us a 5-star review, sign up for the newsletter on the website. That helps us out a ton. And then we'll jump into this episode. So, let's just start with the basics. Who was Paul? You know, maybe something we talked about too is what are, and this could be fun to go into, but 5 facts that people didn't know about Paul.
Mhm.
You know, I've got a list of things of reasons why I think nobody liked Paul. I can share that at one point. We can dissect that, however. But yeah, man, let's. I guess we can get into that. Who was Paul, and what are some things we don't know about him?
I like that framing. 5 things people don't know about Paul, because a big part of what I do and what I want August Media to do is take things that people kind of think they know and then immerse them in a sense of like, oh, maybe there's a lot more to this, and then bring them on an adventure of discovery. And I think Paul is probably one of the most overdetermined figures,
Yeah.
maybe in history, in the sense of like, oh, we know who Paul is. He's like the first Christian theologian. He wrote half the New Testament, like this brilliant mind. And I think if you were to like ride shotgun on Paul's life, a lot of that would have felt like, really? Well, when does that happen? Because it doesn't feel like that right now, you know? And like a lot of his life was characterized by, he probably spent like months or years of his life, like traveling on a road or in a boat and facing extreme opposition, not just from Romans or Jews, but also like other Christ believers. And he was kind of this wild figure that you have to keep in mind. Like, he's talking to a group of people that are largely based in Jerusalem who all walked with Jesus, right? And they have this idea about how things are supposed to work. And then imagine a guy comes in who used to be not a part of your group and then used to kill your group. And as far as you know, never had any meaningful interaction with Jesus. And then he shows up years later and he's like, I had a vision and we got to change some basic stuff. People would obviously have been like, what on earth are you talking about? Right. And I think that's the thing that I'm trying to bring out. So like 5 facts that people probably don't know about Paul. Let's see. Number 1, his appearance. He was almost certainly short and bald. And there's a source from a generation or 2 after his lifetime. So, you know, has some kind of pretty early memory that he was actually bald and had a unibrow and like he was bow-legged. And so I think when people think about Paul, they think, well, I'll put it this way. Warner Brothers, maybe in like 2015, announced they were going to do a movie about Paul, and they attached these big executive producers, like I think it was Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and then they announced, all right, who are you going to get to play Paul? And this is actually both a sort of like interesting film question, but also like a kind of an interesting theological question, right? And they announced, well, it's going to be Hugh Jackman. It's like, oh, that makes sense to a lot of people, I guess. Like Wolverine should play the Apostle Paul. You know, like
who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. Yeah.
Tough, gritty, kind of a, you know, but all right, but what if he was short, bald, unibrow, bow-legged, and he didn't talk real good? Then all of a sudden it's like, well, Hugh
Danny
Jackman,
DeVito.
Exactly. It's like, you're probably more in the universe of like a Danny DeVito or, I mean, but he has to be also like compelling enough and charismatic enough and winsome enough that like you either want to kill him or give him $1 million, you know? So I've got some other ideas about who I think could play Paul. But I think that would be 1. 2 would be Paul thought that Jews should practice the Mosaic law, and it was pagans or non-Jews or Gentiles who should not. And one of the places where you see this really clearly is in Acts, when he heads out from Antioch and he's going out on his own, and he meets this woman, and she has a son named Timothy. And Timothy's dad is Greek, and in that culture, it would be the father who would do the act of circumcision. And he realizes, yeah, but your mother is Jewish, so you're Jewish. And if you're going to come along with me, you have to be circumcised. And so Paul circumcised him. And actually, the Greek, I've never seen it translated this way in an English translation, but it's very clear just from a purely grammatical point of view. Paul himself was the actor who did the act of circumcision on Timothy, according to Acts of the Apostles. So
that is wild.
It is wild, right? I mean, and I try as a historian, you're not supposed to psychologize these people, but when you're kind of like spending decades of your life thinking about them, it's hard not to. And I tend to think like, what a crazy thing to be like, this guy's going to be my like right-hand person for like a decade. And the context of our meeting was I physically, personally circumcised him myself. It's just wild. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a crazy thought.
That's crazy, dude.
Yeah. So number 3 would
and
be.
I mean, like so much could go wrong too with that.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, we want to keep the podcast, rated for all ages, but like, you hardly need to go into, you don't need to say much. And a lot could go wrong.
That's something you don't want to mess up. Yeah.
Number 3 would be Paul, I think, at one point in time, did preach a gospel of circumcision before he changed his mind and preached a gospel that the Gentiles or pagans should not be circumcised. And that comes from in Galatians when he's talking about these opponents that he has who are Christians. And he says, if I were still preaching circumcision, why then am I now being circumcised? Meaning, there's a group of people, Christ believers out there who are preaching circumcision, meaning people like me who are not Jewish. Yeah, you can join the movement, no problem. Believe in Christ, be baptized, and then follow the Mosaic law. And he seemed to also do that. And he's implying I did that at one point until I switched. So thinking about him as like a dynamic thinker rather than like he meets the risen Christ, downloads Christian theology 1.0, and then just starts like spewing facts out. 4 is, I think the best way to read Paul's letter to the Corinthians is that he's saying he was at one point in time married, and he, at the time of his writing, was a widower, lost his wife, and is encouraging other widows and widowers to remain in that condition. And then 5, this is kind of the big one, and really the point of the show that we're making right now. We're making a big 7 like full episode Life of Paul TV show that'll probably be out sometime this spring. And really the big takeaway is like Paul, his whole life was focused on Jerusalem. And I think there is at least a reasonable historical case to be made that his entire life, he would have wondered if it was a success all the way down potentially to the very end, which I think.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah. Which I hope, think about it, like he moves to Jerusalem, spends like 15 years building a life in Jerusalem. And then he meets the risen Christ and loses everything he's just built. Right? He's willing to kill to protect this life. Then he meets Christ and he can't go back. Then he goes to Arabia. This doesn't work out. Then he's in Antioch and his reference point is Jerusalem. And then he travels around Greece and Turkey and his reference point is Jerusalem. And then he goes back and he makes this big collection for Jerusalem. And at the end of Romans, he's sailing from Corinth to Jerusalem. And he's the thing he says, like, I hope that the Christ believing Jews accept the work I've done for the last decade and that the non-believing Jews don't kill me. And so his whole life from like 0 to 65 is focused on Jerusalem. Then he gets shipped off and probably dies in Rome. And if I were him, again, you're not supposed to psychologize, but if I were to, I would imagine that he was wondering if all of this, like what it meant, and was he actually successful? Was his life a success or a failure in the most fundamental terms? And I hope the point of the show is to get people to like wrestle with what does that mean for all of us, Where's that show going to be at? Do you guys have a platform for it? Is it going to be through your website or? We don't know yet. We're talking to a lot of different people, and we'll have more on that before too long.
Have you focused mainly on the New Testament throughout your career? Where have your studies brought you? Is that mainly New Testament? Is it all Bible? I know you travel a lot, and I'd love to get into some of those adventures too.
Yeah. I would describe myself as someone who is an expert in the New Testament, but really is interested in basically everything in the first 4 centuries of the AD, of the Common Era of the church. And for me, that is really interesting and important because this divide that we have, at least growing up in a Protestant world, you tend to think of like, well, you have the Bible that's in the 1st century, and then church history kind of gets interesting again in the 16th century. And it was like totally mind blowing to me in my studies to realize like, well, wait, what happened like right after the apostles? And then you discover like we actually have several writings of people who wrote overlapping with the apostles, with the New Testament, and right after the apostolic period. And so the beginning to read that, like I'm interested in the historical progression from Jesus to the apostles, to the bishops, and to this church as it spreads throughout the world. So like, how does that even happen? And then for me, I became like really fascinated with archaeology because I just find it significantly more interesting to like be in the field and in an archive looking at things rather than kind of just in a room surrounded by books. And so I would describe myself as a historian and archaeologist who focuses on the New Testament and the early Christian period.
Okay, so I'm going to go through my list why nobody liked Paul, and this is obviously just like stuff I was putting down, and then we can take it wherever. Feel free to jump in too. So, well, maybe let's start with this question. But how was Paul received by the disciples? Right, you hit that a little bit, and that's kind of at the top of my list. Was how was Paul received? Because he comes in. And he's been persecuting them. Like I've stood at Stephen's Gate in Jerusalem. And, you read Acts 7 and first martyr went down. And who is at the end of the chapter? Who does it say saw him? Paul was seeing him as he's looking up to heaven saying, Lord, I give my spirit to you. Which I always wonder, like, man, what did that do to Paul for this guy to be stoned to death and him to just like, wow, this guy's willing to die for his faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyways, my question though is like, how was he received by the disciples, right? It's like all of a sudden he's persecuting us. He's run us out of town. And now he's one of us. He's one of the bros. He wants to hang. Do we let him into the inner circle? What does that look like? What's that tension look like?
It's a great question. And I think you're like right on track for the kind of nobody like Paul theme. And what I really want to like get across in some of the content that I'm making for the show and otherwise, like Paul was a man, like if whoever you want to cast Paul as in your head, it needs to be a man who's willing to like incapable of murder or at least overseeing executions. So that's one thing. And then this is kind of what you get just from his letters alone is whether it's 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians or Galatians or Philippians, or the list goes on. It's like in all of these cities, the people that he's actually arguing with primarily are other Christ groups, other Christ believing groups.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like in Galatians, he comes, he founds this community, he leaves, and then someone else comes in his tracks and like undoes what he's talking about. And then in these letters to the Corinthians, it's like, oh, whoever these quote super apostles are, just like be assured I am just as much an apostle as they are. And so you kind of have this sense of like Paul is a little bit of a maverick in this sense, and he's a threat to these other apostles. And this is really, really, really hard for people to wrap their mind around 2,000 years after the fact. But like from what we can tell from Paul's letters, which are the earliest historical evidence we have, that they're written before the Gospels, is that these other Christ believing groups would have held that like, yeah, of course. Well, they wouldn't think we grew out of Judaism and we're now Christians. They're like, we are a Jewish movement. And it's important and a gift to Jews that we have the Mosaic law that God gave to us. And so you, the Goyim, the pagans, the Gentiles, of course you can join, but you should also observe the Mosaic law. And Paul has this vision that the pagans don't need to do that, because then if the pagans do that, it's not the nations coming to give honor to the God of Israel. It's the nations becoming Israel. And that's exactly the wrong way about it. And the way I would describe this is like, if you're talking to a Catholic audience, that'd be like, imagine if someone shows up and is like, hey, I've never met the Pope, never met a bishop, but I just met Jesus and now I'm a Catholic and I think we should not have mass anymore. They'd be like, well, we're just going to kill
Like, who
you
are
for
you,
saying
man?
that. Yeah. Like, or like going into a Protestant, like an evangelical church and being like, guys, I just met with Jesus. I've got this great news. And that's all new members don't ever need to study their Bible. You'd be like, no.
Yeah.
Says who? You know? And that's like the thing, like Paul is a part of, I think of Paul, like if John the Baptist is the one preparing the way for Jesus, Paul is the one like implementing this universal movement that we call the church. And he's facing extreme opposition throughout really his entire life.
That's wild. Okay, well said. All right, so I'll go through my list here. So there are real tensions but they're mostly like how the gospel should be lived out, what we were just talking about. Whether Paul was preaching. Let's see. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, let me start that over. Yeah, okay, there were real tensions, but mostly like how the gospel should be lived out and kind of how we're talking about. Galatians 2, Paul says he opposes Peter to his face.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely some more kind of tension there. We talked about Acts 7, he used to persecute Christians. And then also, like, here's some other stuff. He was blunt, right? His letters are direct and sometimes confrontational. He was under constant opposition everywhere he traveled. He faced resistance, beaten with rods, flogged, stoned, imprisoned, ran out of cities. I love I love what you said. He's kind of a maverick, And what's wild to think about, like what you just said, is this whole time he's wondering, is it worth it? Has all this work that I've been doing worth it? Is it going to make a difference? And then last thing I would say is he just challenged Jewish traditions, which is kind of what you said. So, anything you'd add to that list, or anything you want to dissect there?
Yeah, I want to jump in on his letters. And I think what most people lose when they're reading an English translation, and I'm not throwing translators under the bus because it's just hard. His letters are even more blunt in Greek than you would realize in English. And there's times when you're like, I don't think that's a complete sentence. And it's like very, very sharp. And Paul's probably not writing these himself. He's probably using a scribe. So like I picture Paul like walking around, talking fast, maybe mumbling, and you've got these short sentences. Sometimes he doesn't complete a thought. And then the scribe's like, just trying to, so it's like his,
okay, he's moving on.
It's like, and there we go. And I mean, he even says this, he's like, my opponents say, yes, his letters are strong and weighty, but his bodily presence is the Greek word is asthenes, which either means weak or sickly, right? And his speech is despicable and contemptible and basically worthless. So he's like, he's a real character, and he's the kind of person that I think most people don't have that image of Paul in their head when they're reading these letters, which I think ultimately impacts the way we read the letters.
Which is also like someone like that. You need someone who could spark a movement. You can't do it with someone timid, someone who's, well, I don't really want to get up there. Like, it is interesting what you're saying, how so much of the church and way that we have been grafted in, a lot of it came from him, like 2/3 of the New Testament written by Paul. Okay, I'd be curious, how much do we know about his death? Like how much, have you explored that?
Yeah.
What's like written in the Bible versus what some of the stuff you've you've read or studied outside of that. I'd be curious too, like, what does this lead up to, and why are people so upset that they're like, all right, we need to silence this man? And Nero, I would assume, I think we can get into some of that. I'd love to hear what you've studied on some of that.
His letters take us to a certain point, but obviously we don't have him writing a letter about his death. That would, obviously that'd be crazy. And then Acts takes us to when he arrives in Rome. And then to talk about what happens after that, you're basically relying on church tradition. And I've actually kind of changed my mind within the last few years on this, where I was like, well, I think the tradition that he's buried in Rome, it's not that early. And it's not that uniform. And so I kind of came up with this idea of like, because if you're going to write a TV show or something, like if you want to write a TV show or imagine a film about Paul, you can't say like, here's all the possibilities. And I don't know, you kind of just have to pick one and narrate it as a story. You know what I mean? Like, and so then it's like, well, how does Paul die? Yeah. Well, he says he wants to go to Spain. And the thing about Spain is there's no Jews there. There's no synagogues. They do not speak Greek. They probably, most of them don't even speak Latin. They speak some dialect of Iberian Celtic. So how in the world is Paul, like if everything he's done to have success with these founding of communities up to this point doesn't apply in Spain? Right. And so maybe he goes to Spain. He says he wants to go to Spain. We have some indications that he goes to Spain, maybe just dies in Spain. And that's why we don't have so much uniformity around his death. But having said that, in the last few years, he probably dies. The traditional account is that he dies somewhere around the year 66, maybe 67.
Okay.
In Rome. And realizing actually we have evidence from ancient church historians from that date to around the year 200 that he in fact dies in Rome, and they can point exactly to the place where he died and was buried. And then kind of realizing like, well, on the grand scheme of things, that's actually not that long. And the fact that this becomes such a central point leads me to give a lot more belief to that traditional view. And then it was something like in 2008, the Pope authorized excavations at St. Paul outside the walls, which is so traditionally Paul is brought out of prison, probably the Tullian prison in Rome. And he's walked outside of town on what's called the Ostian Road. So the road to Ostia, which was the port city of Rome. It'd be like going from Houston to Galveston. And then on the way there, the guards chop off his head. And that's where he dies. Right. And then at that place is where they said people buried him, and they remembered it for a few generations, and they marked it specifically. And then once the Constantine declares Christianity a legal religion, they build a church there. And so in 2008, the Pope authorized excavations under there, and they did find a piece of archaeology, not from the year 200 or from the first century, but pretty early, that says like, this is the tomb of the Apostle Paul. So all that to say is like the church tradition is pretty clear on that. And I think the church tradition is stronger there than at least I had realized previously from a historical point of view.
As I'm listening to this episode and thinking what the viewers are thinking too, and I'm like, I don't know if I know a ton about Paul's life outside of, his writings. And so, knowing where he was killed, what, like early writings say, and it's interesting that you have that church that they found that this could be the church they built up on top of where he was executed. But I'd love to know, what are your thoughts? Like, where do you think he was killed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Catholic. I think he was killed in Rome, and he's buried at St. Paul outside the walls. I would say I think and I believe that. If I were to take off my personal faith hat and just use the tools of a historian or archaeologist, I'd be like, yeah, I'm like 50% sure, which is pretty high for a historian of the ancient world, But yeah, I think what I always tell people is, like when I say up front, Paul is one of the most overdetermined figures. There's like 2.4 billion Christians, probably with Paul in particular, another maybe billion who know who he is and think he matters. And they're all like, yeah, I know who Paul is. And it's like, actually, the equivalent of like, a dozen or so long emails that a man wrote in his 50s and early 60s. But he probably lived for about 60 to 70 years. And there's an entire life that we often can't say as much as we'd like, but like we can say some things, and people are just largely unaware of it. I'll give you another one, a kind of sixth fact that people don't realize about Paul. It says in Paul never says in his letters, I was born in this city. But then again, like, I rarely start an email with I was born in Oklahoma City, because that's not like relevant information. It says in Acts that he was, yeah, exactly. Hey, hope you're doing well. I'm born in Oklahoma City. I'd have this request for you. In Acts, it says he's born in Tarsus, but the word born, he may be using in the same sense of like, when I say I'm a Texan, I'm actually born in Oklahoma, and there's a tradition that we get from Jerome, who's about as learned of anyone from that period about the history of the Bible and the biblical figures. And he's probably getting it from Origen, who lives about 100 years earlier and is even more, informed than Jerome, that he and like he's probably born in a town in Galilee called Gishala, or the modern town is called Gish or Jish, and that his family is displaced and basically deported as a result of Roman military activity. And then they moved to Tarsus, right? So what, again, putting back on my historian hat, you'd be like, these guys don't have any good reason for making that up. And they would have been as suspicious of that as you and I were. And yet they offer it as a piece of history, which suggests that very, very, very informed people in the middle of the 3rd and the 4th century thought this was true. And that's interesting, So like people don't tend to make up historical facts that are irrelevant or
really
hard to explain. And so then again, it's like, it doesn't prove Paul was born there, but it does like make me wonder about Paul of like, how would it change the way I think about this man if I don't think of him as just like born a Roman citizen in Tarsus, but like displaced war deportees who relocate to Tarsus in Paul's childhood. And then all of a sudden you're like, now it kind of becomes more interesting about why would this person somewhere around the age 20 pick up his entire life and want to move to Jerusalem? And that becomes kind of like a diaspora immigrant relocation type story that becomes pretty interesting. And that's just like, just a couple examples of
that's really interesting
parts of Paul's life that people don't know about because it's not widely discussed. Even among like people who study Paul, like there's a lot of people who would be like, oh, I didn't know that. But it's there, and it'd be hard to explain why these guys incorporated this if they didn't think it was right. And these guys weren't dummies.
I would love to go into just like what's getting you excited right now. From your recent travels, what are you working on? I would love to hear some of the adventures you're on. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, you are like the Indiana Jones of today, and you're going to some crazy places. I'd love to hear what gets you excited. What are you working on? And then, maybe some of that pertains to this conversation too, but would love to get into some of that.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of joke with people that I've had the experience of sneaking into about a dozen prisons in the ancient world and have cracked ribs and all kinds of stuff. So I would prefer to be covered in sweat and potentially injuring myself in the Mediterranean than I would be in a dusty library in Oxford or something. Not that there's anything wrong with the latter, but that's just my own personality.
100%.
And so I finished a book on prisons, and that came out last year. And we're lucky enough to have that reviewed in the New Yorker and was named one of the New Yorker's best books of 2025. And then I'm putting the finishing touches on another book on early Christians and incarceration, along with a co-author named Naomi Rice. And my book on just prisons was co-authored with a guy named Mark Letney. And so that has been sort of the thing that I've been passionate about for about the last decade. But what I'm working on right now, in addition to building August Media, is I'm working on a show I'm basically obsessed with Paul, as you've heard. I'm writing a TV show on Paul. We're going to make some course materials on Paul that we're going to release on August Media. And then I'm working on imagine if Indiana Jones and Walter Isaacson had a baby and then wrote a book about Paul. That's the kind of pitch that I would have for this book that I'm working on.
I love that.
For Paul. And yeah, I'm just excited to there's all kinds of projects that we're excavating and working on. And some work that my team has been doing in Corinth. And there's some exciting new projects there that we're working on that I probably should kind of hold in a little bit of mystery until we can, have something more definitive just to kind of respect the academic process. But yeah, there's just basically traveling and writing about Paul and early Christians and prisons. That's like the name of the game for me.
Yeah, I'd love to get into just a letter to the Corinthians. And we were talking pre-roll, just how dark and oppressive it was. And some of these letters came across pretty stern. We were talking about some of this on the phone, I think it was, but I'd love to dive into that a bit and spend some time there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, his letter to the Corinthians, your average historical scholar of the New Testament would call it the Corinthian correspondence, because it's actually like First Corinthians is not the first letter to the Corinthians. And we know that because Paul talks about it in First Corinthians, where he says, in my previous letter, I told you X, Y, and Z. And so that letter is just gone. And then you have First Corinthians, and then I'm at least a part of a school of thought that thinks Second Corinthians is in fact a compilation of letters where you have probably up to 4 letters that are there, where Second Corinthians 10 to 13 is a very stern letter where he says, like, you better hope that I don't come visit you, because if I do, it's going to be unpleasant for everyone. And then in chapters 1 to 7, he's like, well, good news. I've decided, I heard about your positive response, and I've decided not to make a painful visit to you. And so it's more complicated than that, and there's more going on. But some people of a more historical bent would look at that and say, the most obvious explanation is Second Corinthians is multiple letters that got compiled into one letter. And there's just a lot that I think people read Paul in a way that is almost too pious. And I'm not against piety, but I think if you start with the history and then move into theology and spirituality, it's like a better progression of events. And like, so for instance, in 1 Corinthians 5, he's talking about this thing where he says, this man he is sleeping with his father's wife, and that's bad. And here's what I would like you to do, which, by the way, this is not to like come to the defense of the man sleeping with his father's wife, but probably it's his stepmother, and probably she's roughly the same age as this guy, because typically there'd be a large age difference between a husband and a wife, right? And if it's a stepmother, then it's a second wife, et cetera. So I'm not defending it. I'm just trying to contextualize it for people, where he says,
Sure.
What he's saying is, once you've gathered yourself together and you have gathered my pneuma in your midst, then I will hand this man over to Satan. And like, I think people just move way too quick past that, and don't like stop and say, like, what's really happening there? Like, what is he actually suggesting? And it sounds a little bit more like, in negative terms, like a seance, or in like positive terms, like some kind of like saint bilocation thing, where it's like, I want you to first gather yourselves. And then once you've gathered yourself, I want you to gather my pneuma into your midst. And then I will hand this man over to Satan. And you're like, this is some pretty crazy stuff that he is commanding them to do. And I think people read this and they just blow by it, and they don't realize exactly what the Greek is doing. And it's kind of maybe tidied up, and maybe some translators have looked at this and been like, no, he didn't mean that. And you're like, well, I mean, the Greek kind of in the power. I'll just give you my translation. This is from the Greek. In the name of the Lord Jesus, when you have gathered yourselves and gathered my pneuma in the power of the Lord Jesus, I will hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. That's like a very painfully literal translation of the Greek. And you're like, what do you call that? Like, what category would you place that in? And for me, I think people tend to move away from the weird towards the comfortable. But if you stick with like what's there, it's a little bit more the weird than the comfortable.
So help me understand why is he just saying, I'm going to be passing you on to Satan, meaning like I'm done with you, or there's nothing we can do? Like my words mean nothing to you. If help me understand that a bit more, why he would be saying that. I'd be curious to zoom in a bit there.
He's doing it out of I will hand this one over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, in order that the spirit, the pneuma, the breath might be saved on the day of the Lord. So ultimately what he's viewing himself as doing is for this person's spiritual benefit, that their soul or that their spirit might be saved on the day of the Lord in the future. right? But in the present, I'm going to hand him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, his sarx. And so I think it's both about like, you really shouldn't be engaging in sexual immorality, especially of this more grotesque sort that even the pagans would look at and be like, it's a little weird, man. It's a little weird that you're sleeping with your stepmother and you guys haven't done anything about it. And so I'm going to say, gather yourself together. Step one. Step two, you then gather my pneuma. He's writing from Ephesus all the way across the Aegean to Corinth, telling them in Corinth, they're not reading the letter. All right, gather together. Okay, check. And then gather my pneuma so that in the power of the Lord Jesus, I can hand this one over to Satan for the destruction of their flesh and the salvation of their spirit.
That's wild.
It is wild. And I think I'm like on a mission to get people to wrap their mind around how wacky some of the stuff in Paul's life and his letters really are. Because I think we've just kind of whitewashed it and kind of, there's like too much pious dust gathered around this that we kind of miss these finer details.
So what makes you excited about, your work with everything that you've done related to Paul's work and ministry? Like what can we learn from him? I see like the human flight, like there's stuff that I will work on for years and be like, man, was that even worth it? Or is it making an impact? I mean, and Paul is, like you said, overly ambitious in so many areas of life. And he's traveling, he's going to all these places. He's, going into the lion's den, so to speak, and he's not afraid of anything, right? He's not afraid of anyone and not afraid what to say. What can we learn from him? Mm-hmm. Like there's that human element of like, when he finishes his life or when he's coming towards the end of it, like he still doesn't know. And I can relate to that. Was it worth it? Did I make an impact? Like what makes you excited and what can we pull from Paul and what can we learn from him?
I think just from a purely like almost universal self-help point of view, I think you would say like, we often don't know when we're succeeding or failing, and we often feel like a success or often feel like a failure. But the reality is, in like the big scope of time, you just don't know. And so like, what can you do? You can like keep going and try to be faithful and try to be courageous and brave. And I would think from a spiritual point of view, from like a theological point of view, you would say like, God is doing something in Paul's life, whether he wants that thing to happen or even knows that thing is happening, So like if you read the Acts of the Apostles, there is a sense in which Paul is a part of planting the church in Antioch because he murdered Stephen. You see what I'm saying? Like it was his murder of Stephen that leads people to flee from Jerusalem to Cyprus and Antioch and I forget the third place, but he's a part of that in a sense, right? And like the narrative you get from the book of Acts is the Lord is bringing Paul to Rome. The Lord is using Paul to take the gospel and spread the church from Jerusalem, its initial point, to Rome, the kind of navel of the world, as they would have thought of it at that time. Right. And Paul's whole life is like, cool, but I'm trying to like get back to Jerusalem. I'm trying to win the approval of Jerusalem. I'm doing this for Israel. I'm trying to save Israel. And God's just like directing him the whole way towards something that he didn't appreciate along the way, which I think in one sense maybe could sound disappointing for some people, but I actually think it's a deeply encouraging message of like, I've heard a lot of priests and clergy and people say like, if you look back on your life, the moments when you were the most impactful in hindsight weren't the moments when you felt the most impactful in the moment. They're often these moments of like suffering, struggle, doubt, opposition. Those are those moments when, in fact, the real fruit was being born. It's just you needed to get through that. And the moments when everything felt like it was going right, like some of those turned out to be pretty unimportant moments in hindsight, And I think that's the real lesson from Paul that I draw. And I mean, like he, if the way that a lot of Greek grammarians read First Corinthians 7 is right, like Paul lost his wife. And if you read Galatians really closely, you get a sense that like his kind of mentor and probably closest friend during his Antioch years, which was like almost a decade, totally betrayed him. And, so he lives this life that's very human. And then from kind of like a much bigger theological point of view, in the reading of Acts and the church tradition, it's like, Paul, like Jesus, needs to be betrayed, arrested, and executed in order for resurrection and new life to be born. And you're like, that's kind of the pattern of like the making of every saint ever since then,
I'd love to zoom in on something, like women teaching and, men cutting their hair. And like some people say they like, you see so many churches split over this today and different denominations split over this, and it can ruffle some feathers. Like, here's an example. I had really long hair once. I like down to the shoulders. We were hiking the Jesus Trail all the time. I was going, spending time in Israel, northern Israel, down with the Bedouins in the Negev. We were in the West Bank working with Palestinians all over the place. I had long hair past my shoulders.
Yeah.
Like some days I'm like, I wonder if I should go back to that. My wife loved it, but I looked like someone who just rolled out from under a bridge after a while. But dude, I was like talking to some friends in Lebanon, and they have a pastor, or the pastor friend's talking to me, and he's like, I just love your heart. I love that you love love Jesus and love the word, but I would never have you teach at my church because of your long hair. And I was just like, okay. And my snarky response later was like, well, I wouldn't want to preach there anyways. No, I'm kidding. But anyways, all that to say, like, there were some, and I'm so sorry the delay here has been brutal, but we're limping along. So some of this stuff, like, it can ruffle some feathers. Paul can ruffle some feathers. What do you believe with some of this stuff? Or what, like, should it be taken as literal that women cannot teach? Is that, do we contextualize that to the location? Like, I'd love to know some of your thoughts on that, because I've wrestled that for a while. I'm like, do I look like someone who's not valid because I have long hair? All that. So.
Well, I mean, it'd be an easy fix for you if you did come to that conclusion. You'd simply just go get a haircut. But I think for me, I would always start with like, what is the historical context and location? And a lot of these, especially like when I talk to some different like clergy from more Eastern churches, they'd be like, yeah, it's very important for a man to have a beard. Otherwise, there's like ambiguity around like that's just what a man does. It'd be like in the sense of like, you don't cut off your fingers, you don't cut off your beard. And obviously in the West, like we just, that's an assumption that we don't have. So I think that is a lot of it. Paul assumes that. And he, in 1 Corinthians 11, it's like, a woman should not have her hair shaved, because then she's basically like a what's the word? Like a prostitute. And so I think that's a lot of it. Having said that, I mean, I do think it is, I guess I'll often say like Paul, would have had a lot of women around him in positions of cultural and financial capital that would have been odd to a lot of people in his day. So like the person who's bankrolling a lot of his travels was a woman named Phoebe, who was the deaconess of the church that Paul was a part of in Cenchreae, which is the port city of Corinth. And there's a lot to unpack there for your average listener. It's like, wait, Paul had other churches other than the ones I know about that have the titles of letters? Like, correct. And one of those was in Cenchreae, and that one was led by a deaconess named Phoebe, who was very wealthy. She was the patron, meaning she wrote all the checks for Paul's travels, and Paul says, and of many others, and so you do have this sense from Paul's letters that I think your average person would have seen him traveling around and been like, I wonder why there's so many like powerful, rich women around and supporting and involved in these churches that Paul is founding. I think the way I would read Philippians 2 would be that Euodia and Syntyche are probably in a similar position as Phoebe in Philippi, and they're probably former slaves, freed women. You've got Junia, who's mentioned in Romans. you've got a lot of other people. And so I think Paul is more complicated on this than your average person probably realizes.
Okay. Basically, I think what I'm asking you is, can I grow my hair out again?
I mean, I've got pretty long hair. I'm sure your Lebanese priest friend would have some qualms about that. I mean, I would put it under the category of like, I'm doing the historian thing. Yes, you can grow your hair out. That's my opinion.
I love it. Next time we've got to do this in person. But any final words, and where can we point people to learn more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for check out August Media, where we got a TV show coming out in the fall. We're rolling out trips next year and courses next year. But in the meantime, we're starting a YouTube channel and Instagram. So check out August Media. Subscribe, follow along. There's going to be a lot more fun stuff. If you found this conversation interesting, I think you'll find a lot of what we're doing there pretty cool. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of No Longer Nomads. We'll be back next Tuesday. Make sure to give this a like, a subscribe. Go to YouTube. Give us some comments there. Get that conversation rolling. Some of our episodes do really well. Other times we could use a little bit of some love in the comment section. And then go to our website. You can find out some of the merch. We can find out more about events and things we're doing if you want to sign up for the newsletter. So thank you for tuning into this episode. We'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good one.